And joining me here on Talk of the Bay is Mark Weller. Thank you so much for being here, Mark.
Thank you, Rachel. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you for making the time. So, this forum you're having, tell us the title and some of these amazing people you've gathered and the purpose of this event.
Yes, it's the People's Tribunal on Pesticide Use and Civil Rights in California. So it's a place where the people put the state on trial, essentially. It's not legally binding, but it's a chance for especially people from farm worker communities to be heard through their testimony about the environmental injustice of pesticide harms. And so it's sponsored by the UC Irvine Law Center, the UC Irvine Newkirk Center for Science and Society, and by Californians for Pesticide Reform. It's a 3-hour event in the San Joaquin Valley town of Lindsay in Tulare County, and it'll be on September 12th from 1 to 4. It will be webcast, and listeners can register online even now for that. But we're also taking vans from all over the state, including the Monterey Bay, to the event on the 12th. So if you have all day on the 12th and you'd like to join us, please let me know, contact me. And 2 of the judges for the event who will question the witnesses and issue a final report on the tribunal are from our region. Dr. Ann Lopez, she's executive director for the Center for Farm Worker Families, and also Robert Chakanaka, the retired president of the Monterey Bay Central Labor Council and a member of the Kupa tribe. So several of the witnesses will also be from our region. Yeah.
Wow. I mean, what a lineup. And I love the format. You know, you're putting these people, you're putting the pesticide industry on trial. I don't know if they can get a fair trial with your jury, but but who's fair here? Who has the money? They probably have a bigger megaphone. Robert Chakanaka was somebody who I talked to a lot during the years. You say he's retired, but what a great guy.
Exactly, yes.
And very articulate and wonderful fellow all the way around. So how will this work? And I'm wondering if we can get a recording. Maybe it's good enough radio theater to possibly run the sections of it later after it happens. I don't know that we could do it live, but we would certainly love a recording if you are going to do that.
Yes, we're certainly planning to make recordings of it.
Please do send it our way. Maybe we could play part of it on this show.
That would be fantastic.
So how will it work? I mean, trials are usually pretty dramatic. Are you going to have the prosecutor and defender?
It will be more of a case where we'll be calling witnesses. And so we'll be calling farm workers, scientists, public health professionals, legal scholars to the stand to talk about, pesticides, and indeed put the pesticide companies as well as our regulatory system on trial. And then the judges, there'll be several of them, and they will, question the witnesses, and then at the end of the event, they will issue a preliminary report and file a longer one later on based on the testimony that they heard.
And who's your audience for that? Who would you like to be listening?
Well, we'd love everybody in the state to listen, of course. We are taking, like I said, members of farm worker communities in person to the event. The place, I think, will only hold about 100. So we should have a packed house. But we also do hope with the live webinar as well as re-showings, maybe on K-Squid even, of the event, that will reach thousands and thousands of people from all walks of California life.
Have you invited legislators?
I'm not sure about that. Sorry, Rachel.
It's okay. I caught you off guard. Maybe you should. They do have the power to regulate pesticides, although we know that last time I spoke with you, there was a very frustrating situation of the regulatory structures that were going to be loosened. That's been a while. Maybe you could catch us up on the current state of pesticide regulation in California. We're talking to a listening audience right now that lives smack dab right in the middle of agricultural fields if not,
Yes.
in the midst of them. So we're in a very heavily pesticide using area. We'd be very curious to hear kind of your state of the state when it comes to regulating these very toxic chemicals.
Yeah. So many synthetic pesticides are harmful. Scientists tell us they can cause cancers, birth defects, brain damage, lung damage, and more. Yet they're essentially invisible. You can rarely see pesticides, but the invisibility is compounded by the fact that pesticides are also shrouded in corporate and government secrecy. So most of us rarely think about pesticides. And when we do, we usually think, well, we're well protected by the regulators. But we're not. Most listeners will be surprised to learn that more than 100 different pesticides that are banned in the 27 countries of the European Union are applied in Monterey and Santa Cruz counties every year. And so nearly half of all the pesticide usage in the Monterey Bay by pounds would be illegal in the European Union. So our regulatory system is not good by world standards. And and the reason for that is it's dominated by pesticide manufacturers and big agriculture. They submit and I'm putting this in quotes, science, upon which approval of their products is based. And they donate campaign money in enormous amounts to keep the lawmakers on their side. So that brings us closer to your question, which is, well, what's the state now? The state now is the Department of Pesticide Regulation, who has the responsibility of regulating pesticides, receives 80% of its funding from taxes on pesticides, called a mill fee. So if the Department of Pesticide Regulation decides they want to reduce the use of a pesticide or get rid of it or limit its use in some way, that means they're also potentially limiting their own income. So there's this structural bias in the department that's supposed to help us, that's supposed to regulate us, that's supposed to protect our public health, to side with the companies and the products they make, which can harm us. So we have a long way before we can fix that part of the structure. But we can push them with people power, with testimonies like this, and sometimes even with lawsuits.
Yeah, and you often do, right? What are some of the lawsuits that are working their way, and what has been the success rate on those?
Well, recently there have been a lot of individuals who have sued some of the pesticide companies over a product called glyphosate, which was one of the main ingredients in Roundup. Some people won tens of millions of dollars from the company there. And there have been, lawsuit. Well, let me talk about one lawsuit in the past, which started here locally in the Monterey Bay region. And I think is one of the main reasons why we're having a tribunal like this, to illustrate the problems we have with the structure of regulation in California. And that case is Angelita C. versus the Department of Pesticide Regulation from 1999. And Angelita C. is a pseudonym for the mother of a student who went to Ohlone Elementary School, which is just over the Pajaro River on the Monterey side in northern part of Monterey County. And they charged the state with a civil rights violation by allowing for their students, Latino students, Ohlone is about 98% Latino, right, in the student population, to be disproportionately exposed to harmful pesticides. And trying to make a long story short, after a 12-year slow-walked investigation by the US EPA, the ruling was that the Ohlone Elementary students' civil rights were indeed violated. But the remedy, there was no remedy really, was rather than give the families any money or regulate the pesticide, they put a pesticide air monitor on the grounds of Ohlone Elementary School, with the idea that, look, if there are high levels of pesticides in the future, we can do something about it then. Well, let's jump 12 years later. The decision was in 2011, and we have seen this pesticide air monitor test for pesticides in the air. And one of those pesticides, of course, is called 1,3-D. It's the third most used pesticide in the region. It causes cancer. Everybody agrees. Most people agree on that, except the manufacturer, of course. And they have registered an amount in the air that sounds very small, 0.09 parts per billion over this 11-year period. Well, the problem with that is the state's official cancer risk warning level is 0.04 parts per billion. So there's more than twice as much 1,3-D in the air at this elementary school than the state says is safe.
So they're still violating their civil rights. In other
Yes.
words, the current students, not to mention the ones that were there 12 years ago. So the
Exactly.
findings and the remedy don't match, and they're still doing
Exactly.
what they're doing. Does it sound like another lawsuit to force some actual settlement or damage control or removal of said pesticide might be forthcoming after the remedy was so weak?
That may very well be. The problem actually got worse because rather than the Department of Pesticide Regulation saying, oh, we've got to do something about this, 5 months after we learned about the new standard, the new cancer risk standard, the Department of Pesticide Regulation decided to create a separate, unequal standard for 1,3-D that allows for 14 times more in the air.
So they
than the
just
state currently
moved the
says is
ruler.
safe. They just moved the ruler for farm worker communities.
Wow.
Separate and unequal and alive and well in 2023.
And
So
people use the word environmental racism when they
That's
talk
exactly-
about this is a
Yes.
prime example happening in our own community. And it seems like the state is off the job making this safe for our children in schools. And your organization is putting them to trial, at least, symbolically, by having a group of people come together in Tulare County. And if you just joined me, I'm speaking with Mark Weller. He is with Californians for Pesticide Reform, and they are holding an event, a tribunal, as they're calling it, on September 12th in Tulare County to put the pesticide industry on trial, even though it has no legal implication. It'll have a symbolic and an educational effect by simply elucidating the many missteps that are happening with public health and, as you call it, environmental racism in our communities. What are some of the people, do you think, what are they going to say besides what you just said, in addition to laying out some of the scientific data that is known?
Yeah, so we'll have a number of scientists, like you said, laying out the scientific data. And a lot of that research has been done in our region, for instance, in the Salinas Valley by the UC Berkeley team known as Chamacos. And we will have people looking at legal settlements like the Angelita C case that we were just talking about. We will have people talking about sort of what community groups like Safe Ag, Safe Schools, which is the local branch of Californians for Pesticide Reform, what they have done to push regulators to do the right thing. We'll have quite a few speakers up there, and we'll have another speaker talk about the harms to and extra challenges that the indigenous communities face. And as I hope many of your listeners know, a large proportion, possibly a majority of farm workers in our region are indigenous people, rather than, so many of them don't come with Spanish or English. So they have extra challenges in working here.
Will you be translating in Triqui or any third language that these folks speak?
I believe that's in the works. It's definitely going to be simultaneously interpreted into Spanish, and I believe we're working on the others. Yeah.
Great to know. If you just joined me, I'm speaking with Mark Weller of Californians for Pesticide Reform. And the Monterey Bay area has been really kind of the epicenter, as well as Tulare County and, further south in Oxnard where strawberries are grown. But our area has a huge lettuce industry and broccoli and things like that do get pretty heavy doses. Can you kind of lay out which crops are the ones that get the most of the most toxic pesticides put on them and which communities are most at risk geographically speaking? You probably have a map, with color coded, but.
Yes, well, certainly the Pajaro and Salinas valleys are where most of the crops are grown and also where most of the pesticides are applied. Now, pesticides do drift, many of them from miles at harmful levels. So, even if you feel like you're far removed from those valleys, you can still suffer from pesticide drift in the air, in the water. Then, of course, a number of pesticides in the form of residue end up on the food you might buy if you're not buying organic fruits and vegetables. So the fumigants, the pesticides that are injected into the ground to kind of prepare the soil for berry growing and in some cases wine grape growing, those are used prominently especially in the Pajaro Valley and also down through the Salinas Valley. The organophosphate pesticides, the ones that were designed to sort of attack the nervous system, they are used a lot in the Salinas Valley. In fact, a quarter of all organophosphates that are used in the state are used in the Salinas Valley, and they're used on all kinds of different crops. A particular pesticide called Dacthal, which the US EPA recently said is too dangerous to use at current legally allowed limits, but they admitted it would take them years to ban it. So they warned us about it. Well, half of all the Dacthal that's used in the state of California is used in the Salinas Valley. So those are some of our bigger concerns. And of course, like I said earlier, there are more than 100 pesticides that the European Union have found to be too dangerous to use that we use in California regularly.
I wonder if anyone has done a study to find out how much we would save in medical costs of, treating people with cancer were we to regulate the way Europe does. Has anyone looked into the financial cost and societal cost, of course, when people are dying, they can't work, they can't raise their families. Those are hard to quantify, but there are a lot of things you could, which is, the cancer rates versus more regulated communities in Europe, for example. Do you know any studies like that?
Yeah, well, there are studies. They tend to be limited because quantifying the harm that pesticides do in dollar terms ends up being a bit of a challenge. In fact, we've been requesting that the state do this for decades now. And I remember one meeting about 10 years ago with one of the higher ups in the Department of Pesticide Regulation kind of looked at us and said, I wouldn't have any idea about how to even begin a study like this. But there have been some studies, Rachel, and they tend to focus on IQ loss. So they tend to focus on certain kinds of pesticides because IQ points and income have been correlated in some ways. I know the numbers are stark, but I don't have them at my fingertips.
It sort of sounds like, when we just became aware of the impacts of lead poisoning that we found out it was having IQ impacts on people who lived around lead paint. And these And that's why we removed it from gasoline.
Yes.
So we did that. We have done important, large things that have affected cancer rates and IQ points dropping.
Yes.
It seems like this one, for some reason, is not adhering to the same pattern that other regulations have. And I was just wondering, if you'd like to speculate on why are pesticides so different than other cancer-causing chemicals in terms of the EPA's approach to them?
Well, I mean, we know from many people who left the U.S. EPA that it hasn't been driven in recent years by the highest scientific standards. That politics have played a huge role in, what ends up in the final studies. So, that's one concern. Now, how does that happen? Well, there is a revolving door, of course, at the U.S. EPA and, frankly, at the Department of Pesticide Regulation in California, of people who work in the industry, then work for the state, then work back in the industry. The last head of the Department of Pesticide Regulation now works for Syngenta, which is one of the 4 biggest pesticide companies in the world and manufactures paraquat, which is banned in 58 countries, but not in the United States.
Listening to this and hearing your story about the school in Pajaro that was found to be, a hot point for this kind of contamination, and the lawsuit that agreed with that, and then they didn't really remedy it. I'm thinking of the other kinds of crazy kind of faux controversies that are being debated about keeping our children safe from learning about slavery, and I'm thinking, why aren't parents screaming about this? And I know they have and they are, but why aren't they being heard, up in Sacramento and Washington, D.C., when parents seem to be heard on these other issues? It's surprising to me that this kind of protective impulse that we're supposed to have as a species is not being evoked in the same way when you talk about little kids, who are getting sick from their schools. Yeah.
Well, I mean, unfortunately, we think one of the reasons for that, Rachel, is racism. It's systemic, but when farm worker parents, and I've seen hundreds of them, go to Sacramento and speak at the public hearings, that's usually where it ends. We haven't seen a lot of action. We've seen some. I mean, in recent years, we have pushed the state to create buffer zones where pesticides can't be applied around schools. We were the second state in the union to ban brain-harming chlorpyrifos, but it just takes so much enormous effort to do something that, if you just look at the at the evidence and the harm, I agree. I mean, it should be picked up immediately. I mean, we should be worried about children in farm working communities and people who live there in general. Yeah.
Mark Weller is Executive Director of Californians for Pesticide Reform. I'm Rachel Ann Goodman. You're listening to Talk of the Bay on K-Squid, your community radio station, focusing on the local story and how it affects your life. In the little bit of time we have left, listening to talk, Mark, I wonder if I could ask you a personal question about how do you continue to do this work when it seems like such an uphill battle? What do you do to rejuvenate your own sense of possibility and hope in the face of some pretty frustrating circumstances that you've just described?
Yeah, we can't win if we don't fight, Rachel. That's basically the way I think about it. And, sometimes seem really dark. And then, if we just keep pushing, we'll have moments in time where we have opportunities to make huge change. And, I'm just one little part of a growing movement. And I hope to help. And, together, we've made some pretty big changes against some pretty enormous obstacles. And so, can't win if we don't fight. And so if we keep fighting, there's still hope.
I think back to the environmental movement that's really surged in the 1970s. And
Yes.
it was because everyone saw suddenly that we were just one planet and we were all working on all these issues together. They didn't get separated out. Over here is pesticides, and over here is fossil fuel burning, and on this side is save the Sierras and the trees, right? We didn't have that fractured thing that it seems to have become, where nonprofits carve out their one area of the environment that they're saving. But if you look at the big picture, all of it matters. The plastics in the beach,
Yes.
The marine mammals dying. It's all part of one picture that we are part of. And to say it's an environmental issue is to miss the point in that we are one with our community, and we're also one with what we drink and consume, and our bodies are very porous. So every single one of us, including the people running these pesticide companies, are vulnerable to an environment that's degraded. And I just hope we can see that at some point, that it's not just pesticides or plastics, it's the corporate takeover of all of our lives and the power imbalance that says they are allowed to do this to us. And I'm very happy you're there doing your job. And I hope you get lots of people to your forum. I really appreciate you coming on the show tonight. And if you would like, in our last minute or so, to give out the information in case people want to register to either go in person or watch it online.
Thank you. The easiest way is to go to pesticidereform.org, and you will see on the first page an advertisement for the event, and if you click on it, you can register for the webinar. And if you want to go there in person with us, I can give you information about vans where they'll be picking up on September 12th, and I'm at mark@pesticidereform.org.
Mark Weller, thank you for being here on Talk of the Bay. He's organizer of People's Tribunal on Pesticide Use and Civil Rights in California on the 12th of September at the Lindsay Wellness Center, Tulare County, California, and online. Thanks again, Mark. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Rachel.
All right. You have a good night.
You too.
All right. Bye-bye. I'm Rachel Ann Goodman. Thanks for listening. Coming up next here on KSQD, it's first person singular, followed by Gary Shapiro and From the Bookshelf. Stay tuned. All of that coming up next. Thank you so much for listening.